Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ben here. I am back again today doing another video. The subject of today's video is going to be on basically trying to figure out which teams throughout or which decades throughout history have been the most talented of all time. And so I was interested in this subject because a lot of times people talk about like, well, the talent pool of the 90s was so much higher because you had Hakeem and you had Charles Barkley and all these great players going up against Michael Jordan and Patrick Ewing and Reggie Miller and etc. 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 And then they say stuff today like there just aren't as many great players, or they said in the 2000s specifically, they said a lot, I've heard a lot of people say there's just like a lack of superstar, all-star power. And so today I came up with a way to kind of try and figure out which decade between the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and then I counted the first half of the 2010s because that decade isn't over yet. So I counted 2010 to 15 as half of a decade, but I'll explain that in a bit. And I just was trying to calculate like which decade had the best players, and how I defined that was so I looked at different players in the All-Star game. So I was basically basing it all around All-Star game selections, and I defined somebody who's made at least 5 All-Star games as a perennial All-Star, somebody who's made at least 10 All-Star games as a Hall of Famer, and then anybody who's made 15 or more as like a greatest of all time caliber player. Now I know that a big part of that becomes longevity, and you can't really like, what if a guy had the greatest season of all time, but he only did it for one season? Like, yes, that isn't really part of it, but it's just it's too complicated to figure out if you're like um, adding in individual one seasons, how great that those were. So I was just looking at people's work overall, like the entire body of work and how good players were over their entire careers. And so I thought All-Star games was kind of like a way where I could do it and it could be accurate, but um, it's not overly complex and it's not overly easy either. It's a pretty good measuring stick, I believe. And so, as I say, I went through each year's All-Star game from 1980 to 2015, and I counted up how many times the All-Star game featured a player who was already or would go on to be a 5-time All-Star, a 10-time All-Star, or a 15-time All-Star. And then, um, so like let's say you have LeBron James in 2005, and he goes on to eventually become a 15-time All-Star, but I even counted him in 2005 as a 15-time All-Star because that player eventually would at least go on to be that. In the same way, like in 1980, I think Kareem was only like a 10-time All-Star at that point, but I was still counting him as a 15-time All-Star because eventually he would go on to get into more than 15 All-Star games, 19 to be exact, the most in history, I believe. So that's something to clear that up. And then also, if let's say you have LeBron James, and each year he made it, I counted him in the 5 All-Star category, the 10-time and the 15-time because he had made it. Uh, he was, if you're obviously, if you're a 15-time All-Star, you're a 10-time All-Star, and obviously if you're a 10-time, you're a 5-time. So that's a bit of a breakdown. So I put this all into an Excel spreadsheet. I totaled some things up, and then I did some averages because obviously when I'm doing the decade of the 2010s with only 6 seasons involved, I can't divide that by 10, or the total obviously is going to be lower than the total for years that get 10 seasons. So I did an average of dividing by the number of years we're accounting for. And then also in the 1990s, they didn't have an All-Star game in 99 because of the lockout. So I only accounted for 9 seasons during that decade. So I divided by 9 instead of 10 for that one to get an average number. So let's go through it, and I think we can get a pretty good idea of how good the players were during that era. So I'll start with the 1980s and just work my way forward. I'll first talk about 15-time All-Stars and then work my way down lower to the 10, then the 5. So in the 1980s, every year there was one 15-time All-Star, and that was Kareem being selected every year during the 80s. And so their average number of 15-time All-Stars during that decade was 1. Then if you look at the 1990s, um, they didn't have anybody in well, Kareem retired, so there was no 15-time All-Stars in 90, 91, or 92. But then Shaq made the All-Star game in his rookie season in 93, so then you get one because he made it to 15 All-Star games. So from 93 to 98, or let's see here, from 93 to 97, you have one 15-time All-Star in every season. But then in 98, you have Kevin Garnett finally making it. You have um, Tim Duncan and Kobe along with Shaq. So now you have four 15-time All-Stars in the All-Star game. So the total for the 90s is actually still lower than the 80s though, just because for the first 3 years they didn't have anybody who was a 15-time All-Star. So the total for that decade is 9, but the average is still 1, so it's tied with the 80s for having uh greatest of all time level talent is how I'm defining that. If we go into the 2000s, we get 4 from 2000 to 2004 because, as I said, you got the 4 of O'Neal, Garnett, Duncan, and Kobe. And then in 2005, LeBron finally makes it. So then you have 5 of those 4 plus LeBron. In 2008, you have the 4 because Shaq didn't make it because he was having a bad season and he was also injured quite a bit. And then in 2009, you had the 5 again with Shaq and the other 4 as previously mentioned. So the 2000s so far is by far the best, having an average of 4.4. Um, let's see here, an average of 4.4 GOAT level players in each All Star game, players who at least made 15 All Star games or more. Okay, and then looking at the 2010s, you had 4 in 2010 and 11 from all 4 of those guys besides Shaq. And then 2013, you got up to 4 again because Duncan made it again. 2012, there was only 2, which I believe was Kobe and LeBron because I think Garnett and Duncan were slowing down quite a bit. And then 2014, same deal, only 2, Kobe and LeBron. And then 2015, it was Tim Duncan's last All-Star game, and so you had Duncan, Kobe, and LeBron as the 3 15-time All-Stars. And now I know that this is kind of a weird way to do it in that I'm defining like the number of times you make the All-Star game correlates to how good of a player you were. Obviously, I realize like Jordan only made 15 or 14 All-Star games and Garnett made 15. That doesn't mean Garnett's the better player, so to speak, but it's just this was the easiest way to do it, and so this is how I did it. So for the GOAT level players, the uh, let's see here, the 2000s did the best with having an average of 4.4. Then it was the 2010s with 3.2 on average every year, and then the 90s and the 80s tied with having 1 on average every year. Now, if we go to Hall of Fame level players, which I define as making 10 or more All Star teams, in the 1980s they had 75 total over the 10 years, which comes out to an average of 7.5 uh, per season. So that's pretty high compared to looking at that 1 every season for 15 timers. 10-time All Stars, you had an average of 7.5 guys every year who were that Hall of Fame level. Moving on to the 90s, that increases. You have an average of 9.3 players every season who were, as I'm defining, 10-time or more All-Stars Hall of Fame level. So this is like a lot of seasons in which you had, let's see here, just to name a few, Jordan, Duncan, Kobe, Shaq, uh, David Robinson, uh, Patrick Ewing, Clyde Drexler. Those are some of the ones that were 10-time or more All Stars. So there was quite a few during the 90s. Going to the 2000s, it increases even more to an average of 10.4 10-time or more All Stars every season. So Hall of Fame level players, there's an average of 10.4. So the notable 10-time or more All Stars during this decade would be who I haven't mentioned already: Dirk Nowitzki, Ray Allen, Paul Pierce. Those are some of the main ones that I thought of or that I was noticing when I was going through this. And then Dwayne Wade is another one too. I think he's made 11 All-Star games. Chris Bosh as well. He's made 11. So that's just a little example of some of the players that we're equating for this 10-time Hall of 10-time All-Star, Hall of Fame level player. Um, okay, and so then for the 2010s decade, you had um, 55 over 6 years, which divided out is 9.2. So you had on average every year 9.2 Hall of Fame level players playing in the All Star game. So if you look at these 4 decades and who had the highest average of Hall of Fame level players, you again get the answers being the 2000s in that they had 10.4. The 90s was second with 9.3. The 80s was third, or no, excuse me. The 2010s was third with 9.2, and then the 80s featured the least amount of Hall of Fame players annually and per All-Star game on average at 7.5. The next category down I have making 5 or more All-Star teams as being a perennial All-Star. So in the 1980s, there's a total of 152 appearances from perennial All-Stars, which averages out to 15.2 per season. In the 90s, we had 154 appearances by perennial All-Stars, but divided by 9, that goes to 17.1 per season. Let's see here. Going to the 2000s, we had 176 appearances over 10 seasons, so 17.6. So again, actually higher, continuing to rise. And then in the decade of the 2010s, over 6 seasons, we had 116 appearances um, by perennial All-Stars, which means divided by 6, that's 19.3. So the 2010s had the most perennial All-Stars on average at 19.3, and then it goes in descending order. The 2000s had the second most, the 90s had the third most, and the 80s had the fourth most. So if we're looking at this on average, which decade had the best players, and I'm defining best players as making the most All-Star games, which I know isn't a great way to do it, but um, it's how I'm doing it. So let's see here. Uh, in So as for the 80s, they did the worst, I believe, coming in fourth in 2 of the categories I listed and third in the other one. And then the 90s came next, having uh, come in third twice and second once. The 2010s came in second, finishing first, second, and third in the three categories in the different years, or excuse me, in the different categories. And then coming in first place, the decade that's been accused of having the least amount of talent, the 2000s, actually had the most talent if you define perennial All-Stars and Hall of Fame level players, and in my opinion, being a 15-time All-Star or more as being a GOAT level player. The 2000s had the most in all of those categories, coming in second only in the perennial All-Star, which is the least impressive of all the categories. So that's just a little quick ramble here. I think that is it the perfect way to define which decade had the best players? No, there are other ways to define which decade had the best players. I could have looked at like repeat MVPs, but I think that this is a good way in that I think the talent pool is high when you have guys repeating as all-stars. Because when you have a guy who's only, let's say, like a one-time all-star, it shows that they're not really that great of a player, and there could be other reasons for that, and they might have just gotten not lucky one season. But if you're repeatedly getting to the all-star game, it's proving that you're like a great player and potentially a Hall of Fame level player or in the GOAT conversation if you make it to, like Kareem, 19 all-star games. Now, yes, some of those All-Star game selections, like Kobe being selected in 2015, no, he wasn't really a great player at that point, but that's also like a factor that I couldn't really control in this, and maybe in the future I'll do this sort of an experiment in a different way. But um, this is just how I did for this one. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope you have a good day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.